Madam Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
I have an amendment. I have,
Someone better reserve.
actually, is Mr. Boucher in the room? He wanted me to wait till Mr. Boucher. Is Mr. Boucher in the back? I thought he was sitting on the side of you. Otherwise, let's go to Mr. Whitfield.
I believe the
Madam Chair, I reserve a
Kentucky
point of
has
order.
an amendment at the desk.
There is no amendment to reserve a point of order for. I will
Okay.
I will defer to Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Boucher is not present.
Does the gentleman from Kentucky have an amendment?
Yes, Whitfield Amendment 02.
Clerk will record the title.
My name starts with a B. Can I sit over there?
Amendment offered by Mr. Whitfield of Kentucky.
Good. Put my glasses.
One, strike from page 448,
Without
line
objection,
2
the
through
amendment will
page.
be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized in support of his amendment.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much. This amendment is designed to do two things. Number one, it's designed to minimize the volatility in the trading market for allowances, particularly the secondary market. Number two, it's designed to provide additional funding for carbon capture and sequestration research. I will be the first to admit that in the bill, there is $1 billion a year for carbon capture and sequestration research for a period of years. But most experts in the field recognize that since this technology has not been perfected, that there is no commercial application except a very small one in Canada and also one in Norway, and that it would dramatically change the way we do business and produce electricity in America, that we need exceptionally large sums of money in order to continue to produce electricity at a reasonable rate. Now, the way that this deals with the volatility, and let me just say that, for example, in the bill there's some international offsets. EPA itself said that if these offsets do not materialize, they could have underestimated the price of allowances by some 96%. In addition, a few years ago, the National Commission on Energy Policy released a report entitled Ending the Energy Stalemate. Panel members of that commission included representatives of the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Consumers Union, professors from Harvard and MIT, and private industry representatives. Their recommendation was that we need a safety valve with a reasonably low trigger to provide stability in the secondary markets. Another reason we need this legislation, this amendment, is that experience in the European Union showed quite clearly that there was extreme volatility in these secondary markets. Now, how do we address the problem in this amendment? Well, we eliminate the strategic reserve that's set up in this bill. The strategic reserve allowances will be available to people under and entities under certain circumstances. But the minimum price under the strategic reserve is $28 per metric ton. The allowances under the bill are $10 per metric ton. And then I might also add that under the strategic reserve, 60% above the rolling 36-month average of an allowance will be the price for the strategic reserve. So my point is, the strategic reserve does not do a very good job or a predictable job on what the price of these allowances will be. And with a bill affecting so many segments of our society, dramatically changing the way we do business in America, we really do not understand how this volatility issue will work. And so my amendment simply sets a price beginning in the year 2013 of $15 per metric ton with a 5% plus inflation increase every year thereafter, just the same as the minimum price set out in the bill. But the difference is that those people that would buy these allowances pay this money into this account, that money would be directed for carbon capture and sequestration research. And that money will be desperately needed if we're going to protect the coal industry. Now, Mr. Boucher went into great detail about what's in here for the coal industry. And there are some things in here for the coal industry. But I can tell you that the coal industry and a lot of other industries do not support this bill. The other side of the aisle was also very good at giving us an opportunity to provide input. But at sometimes you reach a point where you simply cannot agree, and so you have to walk away. And that's precisely what we did. I think this amendment is vitally important to provide the stability in the secondary markets and to provide additional funding for carbon capture and sequestration research. And I would ask all of you to support this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will yield herself 5 minutes. There are many good ways to make sure that a limit on carbon will be affordable for business and consumers, but a technology accelerator payment option, which is just another way to say a price cap, is not that way. The bill already contains many strong cost containment tools, and here are a few of the most important ones. Trading itself is a powerful way of reducing costs, providing firms flexibility to make the reductions whenever they are the least expensive. The bill already provides for a strategic allowance reserve that can be tapped in case of price spikes. And like oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, allowances from the reserve can be sold to stabilize prices. The bill allows emitters to use a generous quantity of high-quality, low-cost offsets to comply with their obligations. And many studies have found that offsets will have a big impact in keeping allowance prices moderate. In addition, emitters can borrow allowances from future years and bank current allowances for use in the future. But this works very differently from a price cap. Instead of controlling costs while also preserving the cap on carbon pollution, a price cap simply abandons the environmental goal. This amendment would eliminate the national limit on global warming pollution. A price cap would create uncertainty, which would discourage companies from investing in the new technologies that we need. For example, we need utilities to invest in carbon capture and sequestration, a technology that will create new jobs and also reduce power plant emissions. By discouraging innovation, a price cap could end up raising costs in the long run. And finally, a price cap would make it difficult for the U.S. to enter into an international climate treaty. The bill also contains a range of features tailored to manage costs. This amendment is unnecessary, and it'll effectively gut the pollution limits in the bill. If anyone else wishes to be recognized, the chair will yield.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to...
The gentleman from California.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate the gentleman from Kentucky's concern about prices. And no one wants to see our consumers pay more for electricity, but price caps is going to act like a rent control. That's what President Nixon tried, and basically we saw the long lines for gasoline. It'll basically make the market non-functional. So I think the trading allowances is a very efficient way. It's a very efficient economic way to allow innovation into the market. So I'm going to stand in opposition to the amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
Madam Chairman, may I have 1 minute to respond to the gentleman from California?
Absolutely.
Yesterday, the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board met, and they discussed the cap-and-trade legislation that is before this committee. And one of the specific issues that they talked a lot about was the price volatility in the allowances. So there's a lot of genuine concern about it, and I appreciate the gentleman from California's observations, but many of us would disagree with that assessment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair yields back. The vote will now occur on the Whitfield amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The chair's opinion, noes have it.
I ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett. Ms. Daggett votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Chakowski. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut votes no.
I would like to be recorded as voting no.
I'm sorry. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Markey. Did I call you? Okay. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Ms. Schakowsky, is she here? I don't see her. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Matheson. Is he here? I'm sorry, I thought I saw him. Nope. Anybody else here? Anybody else here? Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Miss Sutton. Miss Sutton votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no. Matheson. Ready? Whenever you're ready.
All members responded to the vote. The clerk will tally the vote and report it.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 20 ayes and 35 noes.
20 ayes, 35 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.